There's a fish oil trial called VITAL. 25,000 people, 5 years, one of the largest cardiovascular prevention trials ever run. And on the primary results, it found almost nothing. Now, you would think that that settles it, except nobody checked whether the fish oil actually got into anyone's blood. That single fact might be the most important sentence in the entire video, and almost nobody who talks about this trial mentions it. Let's try and get into why. I'm the doctor that your family group chats can't stop forwarding health articles to. Someone sends me a claim and I disappear for a while untangling different questions. Is this true in general, and does it actually apply to the person asking me? Those get confused constantly. And confusing them is basically a business model in health media. And that's the idea behind this channel, The Accidental Doctor. I fell into medicine almost 30 years ago, and I've been practicing pattern matching ever since. This is me handing some of that over to people who don't have a doctor on speed dial. So, omega-3 in your heart. Is this a fishtail, or is there something real here? Here's the honest shape of the answer before we go any further. The headline relative risk numbers you usually hear are real, but they're not the number that tells you what this does for you personally. And whether omega-3 works in a trial turns out to depend heavily on something almost no one checks: whether people's blood levels actually moved. Now, that distinction is the spine of this whole episode. Here's where we're going with this. First, what omega-3 actually does inside your cardiovascular system, the real physiology. Then, the omega-3 index, the blood test that tells you your real-world status, the one that I check on myself. Then, the big clinical trials with both the relative risk reductions that you hear quoted and the actual absolute numbers that put those into perspective. Then, that blood level blind spot in full. Then, a real risk that deserves more airtime, atrial fibrillation, and a clear practical answer for what to actually do. Okay, let's start with the basics. When we talk about omega-3 and the heart, we mean two specific fatty acids: EPA, which is eicosapentaenoic acid, and DHA, docosahexaenoic acid. They're found in oily fish like salmon, mackerel, and sardines. The biological case for them is strong. The question is whether that translates into fewer heart attacks, and exactly how it does physiologically, which is worth actually walking through. So let's open things up here. Omega-3s don't do one thing to your heart. They do at least 4 different things at a cellular level. First, triglycerides. EPA reduces how much triglyceride-rich VLDL your liver makes and pushes out into your blood, and it speeds up how quickly triglycerides get cleared from circulation. It does this by dialing down fat synthesis in the liver, increasing fat burning, and boosting the activity of the enzyme that clears triglycerides from your blood. This is well established enough that it's the basis of an approved prescription treatment for severely high triglycerides. Second, your blood itself. Omega-3s get built into the membranes of your platelets, the cell fragments that clot your blood, and shift them away from producing thromboxane A2, which is a potent clot-promoting, vessel-constricting signal, toward a much weaker version of itself. At the same time, they nudge your blood vessels toward producing more prostacyclin, which does the opposite. It relaxes the blood vessels and it discourages clotting. So the net effect of this is that the blood is less prone to forming the clots that trigger heart attacks. Thirdly, the vessel wall. Omega-3s help your endothelium, which is the lining of your blood vessels, to produce more nitric oxide, which is a molecule responsible for relaxing and dilating blood vessels on demand. More nitric oxide means better blood pressure regulation and less of the inflammatory stickiness that lets immune cells latch onto vessel walls and start building plaque in the very first place. Fourth, and this is the newer, more interesting science about plaque stability. EPA and DHA are raw material for a family of molecules called specialized pro-resolving mediators, resolvins, protectins, merisins. These actively resolve inflammation rather than just suppressing it. Research examining actual human carotid plaques found that the unstable, rupture-prone regions had a specific imbalance, too little of these resolving molecules relative to the inflammatory molecules. And in animal models, restoring that balance produced thicker, more stable fibrous caps over plaques. A stable plaque with a thick cap is far less likely to rupture and cause a heart attack than an unstable one, regardless of its size. And finally, the membrane effect that started this whole field. EPA and DHA embed in the fatty membrane of your heart muscle itself, in the cells, and they help to stabilize the sodium and the calcium channels that control your heartbeat. That's the proposed mechanism behind omega-3's anti-arrhythmic reputation. And as we'll get to later, it may also be a part of the explanation for a real risk that doesn't get talked about enough. Before the trials, one more concept, the omega-3 index. It's a blood test measuring how much EPA and DHA are actually inside your red blood cell membranes. A picture of your status over the past 2 to 3 months and not that of a single meal. I check my own levels periodically for exactly the reason that you're about to hear. Research done by Dr. William Harris and his colleagues found that people with an omega-3 index below 4% carry a several-fold higher risk of sudden cardiac death than those with an index above 8%. It's long-term status and not a single dose that matters, which becomes very relevant in a few minutes. The clinical trials, and I want to give you both numbers every time. The relative risk reduction you usually hear and the absolute risk reduction, which tells you how much this actually moves the needle for an individual person. The Reduce It trial, published in 2018, tested high-dose purified EPA, 4 grams a day, in over 8,000 patients with elevated triglycerides already on statins. The primary endpoint occurred in 17% of the EPA group versus 22% on placebo over about 5 years. That's a 25% relative risk reduction, which sounds huge, but in absolute terms, it's a 4.8% percentage point difference, meaning roughly 1 in 21 people treated for about 5 years. Now, that's a genuinely meaningful number for a preventive therapy, and the trial has a second layer worth knowing, a sub-study that measured people's actual on-treatment blood EPA levels that found cardiovascular benefit tracked continuously with how high those levels rose, not simply with being assigned to the drug in the first place. People whose blood levels rose the most benefited the most. The Strength trial, testing a mixed EPA-DHA formulation at the same 4-gram dose, found essentially no difference, 12% versus 12.2%, a relative risk reduction close to zero and not statistically significant. The Vital trial, the trial that we opened on, gave a much lower dose, 1 gram a day of mixed EPA and DHA to over 25,000 people for primary prevention. Its main combined endpoint wasn't significant, 2.99% versus 3.24% over 5.3 years. But heart attacks specifically were a different story. 1.12% versus 1.55%, a 28% relative reduction and a statistically significant one, though the absolute difference was well under half a percentage point, which means you'd need to treat several hundred people for over 5 years to prevent 1 extra heart attack. And here's the detail that matters the most. The benefit in the Vital trial was concentrated almost entirely in people who ate little fish at the baseline. People already eating enough oily fish saw no additional benefit from the capsule. That's a clean, if quiet, confirmation that this is about correcting a deficiency and not about adding more on top of an already adequate status. So, strong benefit with high-dose purified EPA in people who are already at high risk, no benefit from a mixed high-dose formulation, and a modest deficiency-dependent benefit from a low mixed dose in a general population. Now, let's get back to the sentence that we opened with, because this is the part that almost never comes up when these trials are discussed, and I think it might be the single most important, most under-discussed issue in the entire body of research. Nobody typically asks, did this trial actually check whether people's omega-3 status changed? Not what pill they were assigned, but what actually ended up in their blood. The Reduce It trial did check in a sub-study, as I mentioned, the benefit tracked with achieved blood EPA levels and not just with random assignment. Vital's benefit was concentrated in people with low baseline fish intake. In other words, in the people most likely to have started with a low omega-3 index and to actually have changed and to moved it. Put those two findings together and a pattern emerges. The pill only seems to help to the extent it actually changes your underlying omega-3 status. And that status takes real time to shift. Red blood cells live about 120 days, and the omega-3 index reflects the fat that's been built into those cells over that lifespan. And that means that it takes roughly 3 or 4 months of consistent intake to reach a new steady state. Not a week, not a single blood draw after starting a supplement. And a trial that measures outcomes without ever rechecking blood levels, or that doesn't run long enough for levels to plateau and to see an effect afterwards, can't really distinguish omega-3 doesn't work from we never actually confirmed omega-3 got where it needed to go. On top of the timing issue, people vary in how efficiently they convert and incorporate these fats in the first place, partly for genetic reasons. Variants in various genes, FADS1 and FADS2, those enzymes are encoded, that process these fatty acids mean that two people taking the identical daily dose can land at meaningfully different blood levels. Now, some of this is dose, some of it is time, and some of it is just individual biology, which is exactly why I test my own level rather than assuming a standard dose gets me anywhere in particular. And it's exactly why testing yours is more useful than just counting capsules. Now, to be clear, this doesn't invalidate the trials that were done, and it doesn't mean omega-3 works if you just believe hard enough. It means a negative trial that never confirmed a meaningfully raised omega-3 index is a weaker kind of no effect than one that raised levels and still found nothing. That distinction rarely makes it into the headlines, and it really should. Here's a real risk that deserves more airtime than it gets. At high doses, omega-3 has been consistently linked to an increased risk of atrial fibrillation, which is an irregular, often fast heart rhythm, and it's not something that you want. In the Reduce It trial itself, hospitalization for atrial fibrillation or flutter was more common with icosapentael ethyl than with placebo. So it was 3.1% versus 2.1%. The Strength trial found the same pattern with its EPA-DHA combination, 2.2% versus 1.3%. A 2021 pooled analysis of 7 cardiovascular outcome trials covering 80,000 patients found omega-3 treatment increased atrial fibrillation risk by roughly 25% overall, with more risk concentrated in trials using higher doses. Now, this is a genuine dose-related signal. It's not a fluke. But here's the nuance that actually matters. This comes almost entirely from trials of concentrated high-dose prescription omega-3, 2 to 4 grams a day, in people who mostly already had cardiovascular disease. It's a very different picture from eating oily fish. Large dietary cohort studies actually showed a U-shaped relationship, both very low omega-3 intake and very high omega-3 intake track with more atrial fibrillation, while moderate intake, roughly 250 to 1,500 milligrams a day, you'd get from 2 to 3 fish meals a week, tracks with the lowest risk. Separately, large observational data looking at people's actual blood omega-3 levels found that higher levels were associated with the lowest atrial fibrillation risk, and that people who took over-the-counter fish oil supplements in the general population weren't at increased risk either, in contrast to what the high-dose prescription trials found. So why is there this apparent contradiction? Honestly, nobody knows for certain. My best read is that it probably isn't just about the destination, meaning how high your omega-3 index ends up, but actually about the dose and possibly the speed at which you're getting there. So reaching a high omega-3 index gradually through food over months appears to behave differently than pushing up levels quickly with a concentrated high-dose capsule. I want to be upfront that this specific speed of change idea is a reasonable hypothesis based on how these study populations differ. It has not been directly tested in a trial designed to isolate rate of change from dose. What is solid, the dose-dependent atrial fibrillation signal in the high-dose prescription trials and the apparent safety of dietary level food-based intake. Practically, if you or your family have a history of atrial fibrillation, that's exactly the conversation to be having with your doctor before starting any high-dose EPA supplement. And it's another good reason to get there through food where you can, or to increase a supplement dose gradually and under guidance rather than jumping straight to 4 grams a day. Now, here's what every researcher agrees on. Eating oily fish regularly is good for your heart. Large observational studies consistently show that people who eat fish 2 or more times a week have significantly lower rates of coronary heart disease. In addition to that, they have significantly lower rates of cardiac death. Now, the Mediterranean diet, which is rich in oily fish, is associated with a 30% reduction in cardiovascular events. If you take nothing else from this video, 2 to 3 portions of oily fish a week is a genuinely heart protective habit. And it's also probably the safest way to raise your levels of omega-3. Earlier, I promised you a straight answer. So here it is. If your triglycerides are normal and you have no diagnosed heart disease, focus on food. Oily fish 2 to 3 times a week. If you don't eat fish, an algae-based supplement providing around 1 gram of EPA and DHA daily is a reasonable stand-in, introduced gradually rather than all at once. If your triglycerides are elevated, meaning above 1.7 millimoles per litre or 150 milligrams per deciliter, talk to your doctor. High-dose EPA at 4 grams a day is an approved medical treatment in several countries for exactly this situation, ideally started and monitored with your doctor, especially if you have a personal or family history of atrial fibrillation. And whatever your situation, get your omega-3 index tested and don't stop at just one test. Retest after at least 3 to 4 months of consistent intake, since that's roughly how long it takes for your blood cells to reflect a new steady state. Target should be 8% or above, reached gradually rather than forced quickly. And that's the number that I check for myself. This has been The Accidental Doctor, the home of uncommon sense medicine. If this saved you from forwarding around a bad headline, send it to whoever sent you the last one. Please do leave a comment below. I try to read all of them and to get back to you. And if you haven't already, liking and subscribing is a small thing on your end that does a lot of work getting this channel in front of more people, which is the actual point of doing this. One more thing before you go though. Everything today was about your heart. Next episode, we're going to talk about exactly the same molecule, omega-3, in a completely different organ and asking a much stranger question. Can a fatty acid change your mood? In the meantime, eat more fish, stay well, ciao for now, and I'll see you soon.